Hi everyone, my name is Liron, and I'm a front-end architect at AppsFlyer. And I would like to talk to you today about micro-frontends, but a bit from a different angle. I think that if you've been around the industry for a while now, so in every conference you have at least one talk or slides about micro-frontends. It's not something new. And I actually did this talk a few times before, and I was focusing mainly on the implementation aspects of having this type of design pattern inside our code in AppsFlyer and in general at my past. But I think that today in 2019, talking about implementation when it comes to micro-frontends, it's a bit not that interesting. If, for example, I'm going to show you one type of implementation today and you're not going to use it, so what did you really gain out of this talk? So I changed my slides a bit, and today you're going to get a surprise, something a bit new. And in this talk, I'm really going to focus and emphasize about what micro-frontends different from microservices in general, and what type of friction layers that is going to impose on the way you develop software when it comes to the front-end world. I hope you'll enjoy it. Let's dive in. So just from a quick look on this slide, you can really see that the trend about micro-frontend started around 2016, 17, but recently, like 3 years, and it really picked up since then. A lot of conferences host talks about it. There's a lot of articles that emphasize how you should or shouldn't implement this into your development pipeline. And a lot of developers really sharing their component libraries and design patterns to how you should take that and sharing that to the community. But to understand really why we even started to do this micro-frontends to the front-end layer, we really need to understand what happened to the front-end world in the last 10 years. So let's do a small recap on the, let's do a small recap on the state of front-end. So 10 years ago, pretty much, the only thing that we had in the browser was pretty much this. We had HTML, we had CSS and JavaScript, and that's even a bit of a lie because JavaScript wasn't the same for one browser to the other. CSS the same. It wasn't really behaving or looking the same way. So as a front-end developer, beside of just writing the code that you want to do to accomplish your task, you really need to tackle a lot of friction layers on bridging this gap between all of these different platforms. After 10 years ago, before 10 years ago, we actually introduced Node into the system. And when Node came along, suddenly front-end developers had JavaScript in the backend, and they could start tackle this friction point to themselves. They could start develop solutions to the pain points that they were having. And with Node came NPM. Suddenly, I can consume other people's code in a more sane way with version management. And as the time progressed, we started to introduce bundlers like Webpack that if you tag along Babel to it, suddenly you have transpilers that now shift your code from one way to the other. You don't need to tackle this friction point of different browsers, and you can just focus on what you want to do and not how you should do it. The next step was pretty much trivial. We started to see a different type of dialects over JavaScript, like TypeScript, or Sass over CSS. And now developers are not only thinking about what they want to achieve, they're thinking about how should I achieve it in a way that is more scalable and more maintainable along the way. And the last part of the puzzle came really in the last 3 to 4 years, where you can really see full-fledged frameworks and UI libraries like Angular and React that are really not just telling you how you should construct your code, they're telling you which design patterns you should embrace in and why they're better than the others and which one are more suitable for the other ones. So having all of this beauty and tools set suddenly for a front-end developer, it means that now our apps became much more complex and we started to ship a lot more code into the browser instead of the backend. And this happens quite easily. Your app became much bigger, and developers are scared to really change any bit of code because they're afraid that they're going to break anything. So I guess that there is a few backend developers here in the audience, and they're already saying to themselves, all right, microservices. It solved the problem for the backend. It slayed the dragon at the backend. Why should it be the same use case for the front end? So again, just before I'm diving in, let's do a small recap on microservices. I'm just going to emphasize the important things for me for this talk. The most important thing to remember about microservices and why we even introduced them into our life was the fact that we wanted to have isolated services and independent ones in a way that it doesn't really matter how you take your code and separate it. You just want to focus on the API layer that exposes the capabilities of this service. As long as these services will be isolated and they won't have dependencies among each other, one part of your system can go down, but the other parts are not infected by this failure. So having this separation, having minimum dependencies, if you do it well, you'll get faster release cycle, even that your code base is big, and you have more happy developers and usually happier customers. Now, we are pretty much seasoned in microservices in AppsFlyer. Just a small recap what we do. We are a mobile analytics and attribution platform. Summarizing it only to one sentence, it means that we provide our clients, which are app developers and app owners, tools to understand how do they spend their budget, their marketing budget, when they're advertising their apps. So if I'm really going to simplify everything, we get massive load of traffic and data that we need to process in real time and to crunch the numbers, to analyze them, to aggregate them, and by that really tell our clients how their campaign budget is being spent. Now, we started as a two-man operation in 2012, and in the last 3 years, we grew from 20 developers to 200 developers. So this is a very rapid growth for a company. And we have more traffic, more features, more developers that easily transferred into a very bloated layer of front-end layer. We wanted to tackle that, and we said, why not? We know microservices pretty well. Let's do it in the front end. That will be easy. No, that's really not easy. The same principle apply. You can take your front-end code and you can break it. But there is some added complexity that the front end has that microservices in the back end doesn't really impose you, and you can really neglect it. And if I want to summarize it only to one sentence, it will be the fact that in our case, the user can really see everything comes together in his browser. When a backend developer only thinks about, yeah, I'm keeping my API layer consistent, implementation inside is my business, I'm going to do whatever I want. For a front-end developer, he needs to consider how his part of the system looks against other parts of the system. It can be implied in the way the UI behaves and the way UI looks like. So you have many implementation options for micro-frontends. I'm not really go into elaborating on all of them because the spectrum is really wide, so I'm just going to highlight a few of them so you can get the feeling of where we at today. I think the most simple format of micro-frontends will be just separate it to different NPM modules. You can look at your code starting from tomorrow, analyze it, see which teams are working on which parts, split the code into different repositories, store them in an NPM module, publish them to NPM, and by that having some kind of application wrapper that puts everything together into one app and ship it to production. It's very efficient. It's very easy to get into as a first step, but it has its own limitations, and usually it's just the first step that you will need to adopt later for something more complex. Another option on the middle of the spectrum will be iframe fragments. It's very similar to the first solution that I just showed. The main difference from it will be the fact that now you're rendering different fragments of your app in certain portions of your app, and by that you can avoid redeploy the whole app all over again every time a small package changes. Let's say a team is only in charge of a portion of the app. He's making the change, he's redeploying his package, he's notifying some configuration manager for the main application wrapper that something is changed, there is a new version, and even in real time you can achieve redeployments without touching the main layer, and by that reducing the friction of now redeploying the whole app. The last part is really on the extreme side of the spectrum, is having a suite of apps. Let's look at Google, for example. You have Google Calendar, you have Google Drive, maybe Gmail. They are all productivity utilities, and even if you look 5 years ago, it was all packed into one solution that you can just switch the tabs and go through it. But after they got to a certain size of teams and developers working on them, they decided that it's not sane anymore and safe to work all together on the same code base, so they had to split it to a different suite of products, and by that have a more sane development pipeline. Now, it doesn't really matter the implementation that you will choose, and I'm sure you're going to do your research before you're going to step into that realm. There is some common ground to all of them. Let me highlight them. So, first of all, you're going to have some shared UI elements. And those UI elements are going to dictate the way your system is going to look and behave, and the consistency is really important. You're probably going to have application wrapper, something that puts everything together inside the browser and builds your app. You need to remember that the user eventually consumes your product as a monolith. He doesn't care that you broke it to micro-frontends. You still want to see it together. And your tech stack probably going to be not compromised, but your tech stack is going to imply out of your decision you make, because if, for example, you want to use React, you cannot use different versions of React in the browser. The browser really needs to be able to consume all of it together on one page. Now, in today's industry, you really have to deliver code fast. It doesn't matter for your clients that you decided to go micro-frontends, and it's not their problem. It's your problem right now. And besides the fact that now you will need to invest, I don't know, a sprint, 2 sprints, maybe 2 months to implement this new solution into your development pipeline, there is some added layer of complexity that differ from microservices that Microfrontends has. And we should emphasize about them. Some new side effects that you just introduced, let's see them one by one. So the first side effect will be the fact that now you're going to have some shared code for sure. If, in the world of the backend developer, you have your API, do whatever you want inside, for the front end, it's not the same. Now, it's a good practice to have shared code, but it's not an easy thing to do. You really need to think about the abstraction layer you put in that code. You see how you can scale it later on. You will need to teach many developers about the tech stack you chose and the API layer, and you need to make sure you have enough developers that can merge requests and review the code. So it's not really easy. Let's see a small example. On the left, we can see a simple drop-down component. This component only supports single select, and now comes along a product manager and says, yeah, I want to have multi-select on the right, but we don't support it. So who do you think should add this capability? Should it be the developer in need for this capability, or should it be a specialized component developer? Let's see, what do you think? First option, component in need, raise your hand. Somebody, please play along, come on. All right, dedicated component developer. All right, so we see split opinions, and the truth is there is no right answer. And the reason for that, let's analyze it for a second. If you have, if the developer in need is the one that need to add this capability, so now it means that all your developers need to know the tech stack of the component library. All the developers need to know the design pattern, and you need to have many developers that can review the code and approve it to go to production, and suddenly a small task like having multi-select became something more robust and hard to achieve and with a longer delivery time. But if you go to the other option, you suddenly created a massive bottleneck for all your dev team, because all the teams need to queue now to one specialized team and to prioritize their needs against other teams' needs, and that's slowing down the process as well. So both options are costly, and you need to negotiate the trade-offs. If I can give you a quick guideline to begin with, so my suggestion will be, if you're small amount of projects consuming the UI layer or even any other layer of shared code, I recommend that just manage it by all developer. Is still feasible. Probably they're all sitting together in the same office, and it's still an achievable task. But if you have a larger group of people working on the same code, maybe about 10 teams consuming this code for 20 different projects, in this kind of scale, it's really hard to make sure that all the developers can really contribute to that shared code layer, and I really recommend to have dedicated task force for that. As a small bonus, just think about the enterprise level grade. When you have, I don't know, 50 teams and many, many projects, in this kind of layer, probably what we will need to do is to have several dedicated task force, one working on the current used layer of shared code, and the other one working on the more advanced next iteration version, the major versions of the next ones. Side effect number 2. So you still have a single point of failure, when we just thought about breaking our code to different micro-frontends, we wanted to avoid this friction of having a single point of layer by separating our code. Maybe one portion will be down, but it doesn't mean that the whole system is going down. But what happened now is that you still have it in the front end because you still have an application layer, an application wrapper. You still have a single global state. You have components that are being used in many, many products. If you introduce a bug to one of them, suddenly your whole app is going down because we need to remember all of this code lives inside the same page in the browser in one place, so it is reliant on each other. Let's see a quick example again. For us, as an analytics platform, we expose a lot of dashboards to our users. This is one of them. This is a different one. This is a different one. Each one of them is being maintained by different teams, but if we eliminate the content itself, we can easily see a shared application wrapper that in our case, first of all, decide what's the main layout of the page. It places some common elements like the side menus. It initiating the initial state and initiating integrations, and by that we now have a major single point of failure in our app. If we introduce a bug in one of it, the whole app is going down. By the way, today we have about 30 plus products that using the same application layer. Think about the complexities, what happened when you want to release a new version. Suddenly you have 30 products that are going to consume this new version, and you're scared as hell what will happen if they're not integrating well. So it's a lot more harder. So again, my recommendation on that aspect will be, if you can compromise your resiliency a bit, which means that you're not mission critical to all type of users, stick with only have a single instance of an application wrapper and just consume it all. But if resiliency is a mission critical for you, I really recommend thinking about going to a suite of products and not going with a single product. It will make your life a lot more easier. Side effect number 3. So you just created islands of knowledge. Again, in the world of microservices, when it comes to the backend, it's not a big issue because again, you have separate teams. Each one of them maybe have their own tech stack. They have their own design patterns and needs. So it doesn't matter that they all separate from each other. But in the front end, it's not the case. In the front end, you really have to make sure that developers share knowledge. And I'm not just talking about components. If we see this simple example of form, probably in every app you have at least one form, and most forms today need to go through some kind of a client-side validation. Who guarantees that all the teams are using the same solution? Probably they will invent this way they are validating their form in different ways, which means that you're spending much more time on the same thing that you already did before. Now, to tackle this issue, there is a lot of tools. There is a lot of stuff that you can adopt to your work pipeline that you should be considering. For example, Storybook is a very common tool to expose your UI components. It's a tool that helps us, both developers, to see how the components has been behaving. It helps designers to see that developers developed what they were intended. It helps product managers understand better how the final product will be looking like. And it's a very powerful tool. I recommend you to use it if you don't by now. Documentation is critical, again, to be more self-service for this shared code. And monorepos are really doing a comeback in the recent years. It really helps developers discover better what other developers doing in other solutions in their services. But giving developers only tools, it's not enough. Sure. Well, giving developers only tools is not enough. We already identified that the human factor is key here because human beings are, it's not enough just to give them tools and say, okay, work this out. In this kind of use case, you really need to help them bridge the gap between the teams. So for us, for example, what we did, we started to conduct forums that we make all the front-end developers meet together once a week, once in 2 weeks. In these meetings, they share their experience from developing a problem. Sometimes they're raising difficulties that they encounter, and even review each other's code on a day-to-day basis. We actually added new layer of training that we had to make sure that every new developer coming along will go through this training, because this way you'll be more effective joining the team, working in a different kind of workflow. And we suddenly realized we are not really building a team anymore. We started to build a community within the company that is bridging the gap between the teams. Shared code is treated in AppsFlyer just like any open source library, even if it's not exposed outside. All the developers can contribute to it, all developers can review it, and all the developers can really know and learn from each other by looking on those solutions. So, starting to sum things up, I raised a lot of friction points and differences in micro-frontends comparing to microservices, which begs the question, why even bother? Why am I doing it to begin with? So I want to stress that it's very important to understand these frictions are necessity. It's a good sign that your business and your company is heading the right direction, because eventually everybody will need to encounter it. For example, for us in AppsFlyer, we are a backend-oriented development company, and we do microservices for almost 5 years now. Still, developers in the backend area didn't need to tackle all these issues because they were fully isolated. But today, when they came to a certain scale, suddenly they come to the front-end layer and say, how do you do that? How do you share code? How do you solve all of these issues between of you? And they actually started to build their own communities based on the concept that we already learned in the past 2 years. So, to summarize, and key takeaways from this talk, Microfrontends is a very powerful tool, and to be frank, it's the only tool you have when you go to a certain size. It's just important to realize that it's not something that you can just throw into your system and expect it to work. Make sure you start small. Like I mentioned before, a simple separation of your product into different modules and managing them in different repositories can take you a long way. Only when you feel that it starts to slow you down, add another layer of solution to your work pipeline. And like I mentioned at the end, it's more than just JavaScript tricks. It's not an implementation that you can just adopt and that's it. You will have to invest in the people, and otherwise that will fail your product and service much faster than the implementation that you will choose. The last thing I want to mention is that it's not something that happens overnight. It's a complex change. It's a complex addition to your work. And it's not like a sprint, it's more like a marathon, and you should treat it like that. Start slowly, add more exercise to your training, and eventually you'll reach that main goal that you wanted to achieve in the beginning. So you better get in shape. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.